Now that's a really big sword. Welcome back, sword friends. Today, I have the Swordier SWM-1038 Type XXa Longsword from Swordier. Now, a little disclaimer before I start. This sword was sent to me for the purposes of review. There is a little bit of a caveat to that, but I did not spend any money on this sword whatsoever. This was sent to me by Alex after I had commissioned them to make me a Type XXa that was a little bit different. So, a little bit of a backstory. When this sword came out, I looked at it, and there were a couple things that I didn't think were incredibly, I guess, historically accurate based on the extant models that we still have of Type XXa and Type 20. So I contacted Alex and I gave him some specifications to redo the blade in a style that was a bit more in line with the pieces that we currently have. Now, fast forward several months, and we actually now have that new sword that is being sold by Swordier, which is the SWM-1038, the upgraded Type XXa model from this one right here. So that one I'm really excited about when I get my hands on it. But this sword deserves a bit of its own review as well, for those who were interested in this particular style of blade, specifically with the fittings being pretty vastly different and the blade shape being a little different as well on the 1038. Perhaps this beast of a sword is something more in line with what you're looking for. For those of you who are not familiar with Type 20 and Type XXa, they are pretty easily one of my favorite swords in the oakshot typology. They are a return of the great swords of war that were popular in the 13th and 14th century, specifically upgraded versions, if you want to call it that, of the Type 13A and 12A. The reason why I did those numbers backwards is because if you ever look at a Type 13 had a more spatulated round tip and was pretty much a dedicated slashing blade. Whereas the Type 12A was a bit more of a cut and thrust with a more acute tip, maybe not incredibly acute, but more acute. So the Type 13 was more like the Type 20, and the Type 12A is more like the Type XXa in terms of what their purposes were. Now, I've always had a fondness for the great swords of war. I like the larger long swords, the ones that were designed to be very, very powerful cutters, very, very just robust blades. And that's what you're gonna get with this particular sword. Now, before we actually talk about the blade itself, let's start with the scabbard. This sword comes with a standard scabbard similar to all the Swordier swords, which I actually really do appreciate. The price of this entire sword is actually, as of right now, $280 US. So it is very, very firmly in the budget range of swords. And $280 is not a lot of money for any sword in particular, but a sword as robust as this Type XXa is, it's considerably cheaper than what I would be expecting for a sword like this. Now, in order to keep the price down, when you get things like these scabbards, they do their job. They're not the best thing on the planet, but they're not the worst I've ever seen either. Unlike the last model, it looks like they have upgraded the leather a little bit. The leather is still fairly cheap. You can tell from just the feel of it. Texture of it is a little off. And the stitching, while actually quite good, as I try to manipulate the belt around, you'll see the stitching on here. It doesn't look frayed or anything like that, but it's not very tight of a stitch, I guess is how I would say it. And probably I could see this coming undone fairly easily, especially if the scabbard got knocked around at all. It does come with a retention belt, or a suspension belt rather. It comes with a suspension belt, but I'm not entirely sure how this one is meant to be held on.
I have absolutely no idea what's going on.
It looks like a singular point of suspension to hold on. And without any risers on the scabbard, I have a feeling this would probably slide a bit more, but you can adjust it to make it so that it would fit a little better. It's not a bad addition, but you can definitely see the inside of the leather is not of the highest quality I've ever seen. So you'll actually see that right here. It's not terrible, but it's clearly tore up and probably would not last very long with any amount of sustained heavy use. The metal chape here at the bottom, they did add some decoration to it. It looks like it's just a laser etching that they put on this. It's a nice little addition, and if you weren't real fond of the overly garish scabbard of the Type 16A that I reviewed earlier, they did away with the imprinting pattern on this sword and instead only put the pattern here at the end. The scabbard itself, very similar to the last one, tends to have little rubber, I don't know what I would call those. They almost feel like either foam or perhaps like rubber double-sided tape to give it a little bit of retention. I will say it is actually very tight in here. Not so tight that you can't withdraw it from the scabbard, but it is pretty tight. Like, I'm sitting here shaking this and it's not coming out. It does take a bit of a pull in order to get this out, which is actually quite impressive for a sword of this price range to have a scabbard with that level of retention in the first place. Now let's talk about the fit and features of this sword. We'll start here at the top. One thing that they did upgrade with all these fittings over the last model is they did include a better polishing on the crossguard and the pommel. The pommel itself, you'll see here, it is a peened construction like the others, but the polishing job is actually quite nice. It is very smooth to the touch. There's no pitting like in the last one. The engraving on it is a bit washed out in certain places. However, you'll see the polishing right here actually seem to have removed a lot of the actual engraving, so it's much harder to see on this one because the polishing removed a lot of material off the pommel, and therefore the engraving is not as deep as it was on the last one. The crossguard, however, does not suffer in that way because these were a lot deeper than the engravings on the pommel, so you don't actually see as much of a problem with the crossguard, and it's much shinier than the last one. One thing I'll say about the grip, I really like the shape of the grip. It features a waisted grip construction with a central riser here in the center, but they also have a bit of a concave section here at the first part of the grip where your hand really does just seem to fit in to that groove. And then the later half of the grip tapers down all the way to the pommel, allowing you to have a very firm grip when you're doing this, with quite a bit of space to actually hold the sword and move your hand up and down the blade. If you like it closer, you have the ability, or you could choke down here on the fishtail pommel, which really does work really well to hold your hand in place. I was never really a big fan of fishtail pommels until I got these ones and then realized how nicely my hand will slide down onto them.
I like it a lot.
It makes for a very secure grip. The leather seems to be of the same material as the scabbard, so it's not the highest quality, but it doesn't feel terrible. I felt much worse leather on different different handles before. This one's not terrible. The stitching, while you don't really feel the stitching on the sword itself when you're holding it, you can, but it's not anything that causes a hot spot. But because of how the stitching is done, and I'm not entirely sure about how tight it is, there are specific points, especially here at the riser, specifically on this model, where you can see the leather bunches up a bit. And if I were to take my nail in here and start tearing away at it, I could easily pull this leather away. So I do feel like this will probably become loose or possibly even undone with any level of really serious heavy use. So you may end up having to rewrap this or possibly take some leather glue and resealing this after the stitching has come out and the leather starts to loosen. While I've not taken apart this handle, I definitely suspect that this handle is a 3D printed handle. 3D printed handles are a double-edged sword, so to speak, because a 3D printed handle allows for them to create the same handle over and over and over again once they create the model and apply it to each one of their blades. However, I have concerns about the material used in 3D printing and how it handles vibrations. Generally, these plastic handles that you see send a lot more vibrations into your hand than a standard wood handle would. Now, a wood handle needing to be carved every time likely would have increased the price, so I understand the idea of a 3D printed handle for these swords. I just have concerns about it. Moving on to the blade itself. As you can see, the blade is very, very, very thick, all the way out to a pretty thick point, to be honest. This is where I'm not as impressed with this particular model as I was with the Type 16. Because first off, this is not only a beastly sword, it is a heavy sword. It comes in at 3.3 pounds, or I believe that is something like, I wrote it down,
a lot of boring math later.
Almost 1,500 grams. Almost 1,500 grams. Now, 3.3 pounds is not outside of the realm for a longsword. Specifically, there's several swords on the market today that either are above 3 pounds or almost close to 4, if not a little over that. But when you start dealing with blade harmonics and how these swords are designed, 3 pounds can feel really, really heavy if the weight of the entire sword is not more balanced, but instead way, way out here. And that's what this sword has. All 3.3 pounds, 1,500 grams, feel like the weight is all the way out here near the tip, rather than closer to the crossguard, which makes this feel very, very heavy in the hands. When you swing the sword or anything of that nature, it moves, but being able to stop it, that's another situation altogether. Even while I'm over here trying to manipulate the blade and move it around, the blade seems to want to go where I don't want it to. Gravity is pulling the blade down when I want to manipulate and move the tip. And if this really is a Type 20A sword, which I do believe it is, the tip is maybe a little less acute than some models, but it's definitely more acute than other Type 20s that had a more rounded tip. So I do believe this is a Type 20A, which I'm really excited about. With the Type 20A being a cut and thrust, thrusting was indeed important with these swords. And if you can't control where the tip goes, you're gonna have issues. And because the weight is so far out here, I feel like you're going to have issues controlling where this goes. Now, I don't know what your opinion is on the actual triple fuller design. I love triple fuller designs, and one of the reasons why I contacted Swordier and helped develop a different sword that had a bit more of a historically accurate blade, I think their fullers are a bit too long on this sword. Fullers, the two smaller fullers, are about 1/3 of the blade, and this one goes about 2/3 of the blade, the central fuller. Most of the models that I've seen have been closer to the central fuller only going to about half of the blade, and these ones are about 1/4. So these are a bit longer than what I've seen on historical models, as well as even other production models that have the triple fuller design of the Type 20 and Type 20A. Now, not all Type 20 and Type 20As had this, but I definitely feel like this is more of an iconic look that separates them from other swords. If you look at, say, the Albion Viceroy, which is categorized as a Type 20A because of the blade shape, time periods used, and its use, it is a Type 20A. It has more of a ricasso here, but not much of the triple fuller design that I feel is very characteristic of these swords and sets them apart from other swords in the Oakshott typology. All right, let's talk about the blade. It's a gorgeous blade, but the problem that I have with the blade itself is the lack of distal taper. I took 3 measurements like I normally do. Obviously you can have more points if you want, but for the sake of this, I only do 3, which is at the base, right by the cross guard, about halfway up the blade, and then again, right about at the tip. And when I took the measurements, I had 5.8 millimeters at the base. I had 5.4 millimeters here about halfway through, and only 4.25 millimeters here at the tip. So in the later half of the blade, there seems to be a bit more taper than in the rest of it. But while I wasn't in the forge actually making the sword with them, I would almost suspect that the distal taper that is part of this blade was not done intentionally. Meaning it wasn't forged with that in mind, but rather the distal taper happened during the polishing and sharpening process, because the amount of material actually removed from base over here to the tip is only a little over 1 millimeter. It's not a whole lot. And when you actually look at the blade from straight on, it is very, very, very hard to actually even visually see any distal taper. It makes the blade very robust, that is for sure, but the extra weight out here doesn't so much give authority in the cut as in this blade tells you where it's going and pulls you along with it. I don't think that authority is quite the same. It's more like it dictates the cut and you just have to follow along with it. Now, if you watched the first impression video, you'll know as I was talking about the blade, I had it sitting up on a rack and I was just hovering my hand across it a little bit. And I actually slid the top of my hand up against it just very lightly and ended up cutting myself. So the blade does come very sharp right out of the box. But I do have a piece of paper. We'll do a paper cutting test for it real quick. The first one, what I'll do is I'll just insert the paper or insert the sword into the paper. Perfectly clean. And if I try to cut the edge of the paper, that one seemed to tear. It started, but then it started to tear a little bit. And sometimes I wonder if it's just the paper that I have and I'm not holding it tight enough. That one started a lot better and cut straight through. So it definitely is very, very sharp. But how about we go check how sharp it is on some real targets. All right, let's see if I stake better this time. At least I hope so. Oops. All right, I'm still a little concerned. The blade, because of the lack of distal taper, is very, very heavy. But we'll see when we're looking here for percussion points. It looks like I have to cut right about here in order to get this to work. So let's see. Not too bad. All right, let's give it another go. That's pretty nice and clean. All right, we'll try from this way. I definitely feel a lot of vibration in the blade when I cut. So the major thing that I see with the sword, you'll see the cut itself started really, really smooth. Only got about halfway through. I think the problem was I started feeling a lot of vibration in the blade handle, and there was a lot more wiggle than I was expecting. So if you don't hit exactly at the point of percussion, there's so much vibration in the blade, it does make it hard to cut this target. It cuts well when your edge alignment's good. If you're off even a little bit, you're gonna have some issues. But let's go ahead and see if we can cut something else. All right, we got ourselves another pool noodle. This should test more of the edge sharpness rather than anything else, because if the edge isn't really sharp, you're gonna have issues cutting through the noodle. The noodle does look pretty clean there. Going downward, it looks like we ripped a little bit, but it's not doing terrible. That was a clean cut. That was a real clean cut. I will say though, that's a lot of flex in the blade. It was a fairly clean cut for the most part, but it did seem to scallop near the edge, so it's not as clean as it could be. Again, not terrible, but you'll see how it scallops at the bottom. I think that's due to the flex in the blade. The blade itself, while being very thick, has a lot of wobble to it. And you'll see it is really, really flexible. Overall, it cuts. I wouldn't say it cuts overly well, nor is it a real joy to cut with or anything of that nature. There's a lot of vibration in this handle, and with the blade being so forward heavy, You have authority in the cut, but not a lot to come back and do a counter. Final thoughts for this sword. After the cutting session with this sword, my opinion of the blade has changed pretty drastically. If I were to rate this particular sword, I would rate it at a 3.5 flamboyant lance connect out of 5. I gave 3/4 of a point for the aesthetic because the blade itself is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. The fittings, the leather on the handle, while it is cheap leather, for the price it's really good. The blade is beautiful, but I took 1/4 of the point off solely because my particular one had that staining on the blade. If it didn't have the staining, I'd give a solid point for the general aesthetics of the sword because it is absolutely gorgeous. There's nothing on it that seems out of place. I mean, even the gap, while there is a gap in the blade itself, right here at the cross guard, it's not as bad as some other swords. And I've seen a lot worse at this price point. I've seen a lot worse at higher price points. I've seen better as well, but to be honest, for a budget line sword, it's not bad. Given the fact that all these fittings are cast and then put together, it's really not bad. It's just the staining on the blade itself. Personally, I'm not fond with what I consider the anachronistic three fuller setup because this central fuller is a bit too long, which is historically available on extant models of these blades. The historical artifacts that we have, I don't believe had quite this fuller configuration. I'm sure some did in history, so I wouldn't even talk about that in terms of actual point deduction, just a personal preference really. But if you actually like this, it does fit. Durability, this thing is strong. Like the flex, it's hard because it feels like being at such a strong blade, it doesn't feel like it flexes that easy when you try to flex it. But if you saw the cutting footage, it flexed a lot more than what I was expecting it to flex. And that could also be all the way down here at the handle and causing a bunch of vibrations that way. It was a little strange, but at no point did I feel like this sword was going to let me down, fall apart, or anything like that. It took no damage in any of the cutting, not one bit, not even any kind of nick. The closest I have here is there is a very, very, very shallow surface layer scratches from cutting the tatami. But that just happens when you cut tatami. And honestly, it is so shallow, I have to have it in just the right light in order to get it to actually show up on the blade itself. So it didn't even really take a whole lot. And if you cut with your sword, you're gonna get those surface scratches. It just happens. You can always buff them out later if they really bother you, but the only way to prevent yourself from getting those surface scratches is to never use the sword at all. It just happens. Now, where this thing really hurt was the handling. I only gave it 1/4 of a point for the handling because it just was not fun to cut with. And when I was doing cutting, if your edge alignment was not 100% perfect, the flex in the blade made it almost scallop the targets out, so you'd have these shallow scoops in all of your cutting because of how much this blade flexed, which was surprising for how thick it is. So that was a bit less fun. And as I said, this thing being a bit of a dictator, not so much having authority in the cut, but rather dictating where it was going and would drag you along with it, made it not fun to recover. It was very hard to recover. Lastly, the complaint that I had earlier, the suspicion I had about 3D printed handles really did ring true with this model. The plastic that they use for the 3D printed handles sent the vibrations up through my arm. Now, the 16A that I have has the same 3D printed handle, yet the overall balance of the blade compensated for it, and I didn't feel the vibrations I felt with this sword. It was, I won't say painful to cut with, but it wasn't pleasant. And that made it to the point where I really just, I did not enjoy actually using this sword as much as I did the 16A. It cuts, it's a powerful cutter. It's just not very fun to cut with. It is very hard when you're actually trying to control the blade to get the point where you want it, because it just wants to go where it's gonna go, not so much where you want it to go. And it causes a lot of handling issues. So I think that's where this sword suffers the most. Lastly, the cost to value. It is $280 at the time of this recording for this sword. What you get for that sword, is it worth it? That's why I gave it a half point. Yes and no. It's not a no, but it's not an emphatic yes either, because the handling really makes me not enjoy this sword as much as I did other Swordier offerings. This one was very clunky, and if you're used to heavier blades, especially forward heavy blades, maybe it won't bother you as much. Or if the sword just speaks to you because of its look, because there are very few swords that look like this on the market, is it worth the price? For you, it might be. For me, I don't know if I would buy this knowing what I know now, especially with some of the other models, especially the upgraded version that Swordier just did. I don't know if I would buy this model. Unless the aesthetics really called to me. Now, if the aesthetics really called me, yeah, it's a pretty good buy. And for the price, it's not terrible. And what you get is an insanely beastly sword for the money. All right, we're on.
Now you can see how you are.
Well, you can see me now, but I can see myself too. All right, so what I'll do is I'll walk onto the thing and I'll say, now that we're out here doing cutting, first thing we'll do is we'll test initial sharpness with a paper cut. All right. Okay. All right, now that we're out here, before we edit. No, you can leave it run. I don't care. I'll do whatever. All right. I know, you gotta get everything right. My assistant. All right.
What paper do you want first?
Well, now you messed up that entire take. Do the big one first. That was a good question, though. All right. No, leave it go. I'll tell you when to stop. Don't worry. I can edit all this out. Now that we're out here, I'm trying to get the words right, and I'm getting them all wrong. This will go into outtakes. Yeah, well, I think it's funny. Before we get cutting, let's go ahead and do, oh, I'm totally out of frame. Oh my goodness, I gotta be stepping further away. I thought it was closer. It's right here, okay. All right, I was too close. Before we get cutting, let's go ahead and do a paper test. And now my person walked away. All right, we'll just... Now we're gonna try some water bottles. We're gonna start with the easiest cut first, which is just a water jug from a milk jug. It wasn't too bad, but the edge is not clean.